She gave him 10 years of loyalty. He gave her a letter. Claire Halstead wasn't just any secretary. She was the quiet heartbeat behind a billion-dollar empire, showing up before dawn and staying long after everyone left. For 10 years, she carried her boss's secrets, held his schedule together, and never once crossed the line, until one night in Asheville changed everything. The next morning, without explanation, he fired her. No warning, no words, just silence in an envelope. But what he didn't know was that Claire wasn't walking away alone. Now, in a small river town miles from the life she once knew, Claire is building a new future for herself, and for a child he never even knew existed. But when the past comes knocking, can a heart so broken ever learn to open again? Why did he fire her so suddenly? What happened that night in Asheville? And when he finds out the truth, will it be too late? This is a story of heartbreak, resilience, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to disappear. Like, share, and subscribe to join us, because this story is just beginning. Claire had arrived early, just like every other morning. She always did. It wasn't out of obligation or fear or some misplaced eagerness to please. It was habit, ritual, almost a quiet kind of devotion to the order she built around her. At 7:25 a.m., she stepped through the familiar revolving doors of the Metasphere headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina. The humidity was already settling like a heavy shawl over the city, but inside the marble-floored lobby, the air was crisp and still. She gave a polite nod to Carl, the morning security guard, and offered a faint smile, the kind that said yes. It's early, but we're both here again. She didn't stop to get coffee. She never did. Her first cup would come exactly 8 minutes later, after she'd reviewed Graham's calendar for the day, printed the reports he always wanted in hard copy despite the digital age, and adjusted the thermostat in his office. He hated when the air felt too cold, but that morning, one small, unfamiliar detail broke the rhythm. There, on her desk, sat an envelope, cream-colored, no name, no logo, just waiting. Claire paused. The world didn't. Phones rang faintly down the hallway. The distant hum of the elevator signaled someone from legal was arriving early. But she stood there, her hand still gripping her bag strap, and stared at that envelope like it didn't belong in her day, her desk, or her life. She sat down, gently this time. Her breath shallowed, fingers tightening around the envelope as she finally picked it up. The paper was thick, expensive. Inside, neatly folded on Metasphere letterhead, were just a few sentences clean, cold, unyielding, effective immediately. Your position has been terminated. Your final paycheck and severance are enclosed. We wish you the best. Her eyes didn't move past the second line before the sting of heat rushed to her cheeks. Her throat closed, not from panic, but disbelief. No explanation, no warning. After 10 years, Claire glanced toward the glass wall of Graham Whitaker's office. He was inside, seated, reading something. His brow was set, his posture rigid, jaw clenched just so. He didn't look up. He always looked up. Even when he was exhausted, even when they barely spoke, he'd offer a glance, a silent check-in, as if to say, we're still on the same page. But not today. Today, he didn't so much as flinch. Claire folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope with care that felt absurd. She sat there for another minute, unmoving, as if the seconds might reverse if she held still long enough. But they didn't. Then, slowly, with fingers that only trembled at the edges, she opened her drawer. There wasn't much. A notepad with her shorthand scribbles, a framed photo of her mother, taken just weeks before her final hospital stay, a paperweight Graham had given her 5 Christmases ago, glass, smooth, heavy, etched with the Metasphere logo and a single word, essential. She put it all into her leather tote, layer by layer, as if packing up her identity. She'd spent a decade here, not climbing the ladder, not asking for promotions or praise, just holding everything together, managing every call, smoothing every edge, anticipating every mood, every pivot. She'd filled the spaces between other people's ambition, and now she was being erased. The HR director, a woman Claire barely knew, appeared beside her desk as if on cue. Her face carried that careful, polished sadness HR people wore like a blazer. Claire followed her to Graham's office. The door clicked shut behind them. He stood when they entered. Graham was tall, composed, and dressed in charcoal gray today, his usual uniform. But something about him looked unfinished, like he hadn't slept. Or maybe he had, but poorly. His tie wasn't centered. His cuff was unbuttoned. Claire waited for him to speak. He didn't. The HR woman handed over some forms, spoke softly, a script, surely. Claire nodded in all the right places. She didn't trust herself to speak yet, not until she looked directly at him. And when she did, it hit her. He wasn't just distant. He was detached, as though she'd never been anything more than a role to him, a fixture, replaceable. But she knew better. They both did. Claire looked down at the envelope in her hands, then back at him. Her voice came low and even. She didn't ask why, didn't ask how, just this. Is this really about that night? Graham blinked, barely. His jaw flexed, but still, he said nothing, not a word, not even a nod. That silence so full of things unsaid was louder than any outburst. Claire didn't wait. She turned, thanked the HR rep with a nod that meant nothing, and walked out. Past her desk, past the intern who was already slipping into her seat, not knowing what shadow she was stepping into. Outside the building, the Charleston heat clung tighter than before. The sun had risen, and the city was waking up. Horns blared in the distance. A child laughed somewhere on the street. Life, apparently, went on. Claire reached her car and sat behind the wheel, both hands resting motionless. The letter still sat in her lap, unread beyond the first cruel paragraph. She didn't need the rest, because no matter how many words were typed on that page, the truth had already settled in her bones. And just like that, 10 years of her life were reduced to a single page. Next. But the ending he gave her would become the beginning she never expected. You don't pack a decade into a cardboard box without packing pieces of yourself too. Claire sat alone at her desk for the last time, the city waking outside the windows behind her. The early morning haze of Charleston filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across her keyboard and the framed photo that had sat quietly by her monitor for years. Her fingers hovered over that frame, now the picture of her mother, cheeks hollow from illness, but smiling, always smiling. Claire had placed it there her first week at Metasphere, back when the grief was still raw, still clawing at her lungs in the quiet moments. That photo had been her anchor, her reason to keep moving forward when forward felt impossible. She lifted it gently and wrapped it in a soft scarf from her drawer. One by one, she began placing things into the box, the bottle of rose perfume she never wore, but always meant to. A leather-bound notebook filled with to-do lists and notes in her own tidy script. A paperweight from the company's 5-year celebration glass, with the Metasphere logo etched into its center like it meant something solid, something permanent. It didn't. At the very bottom of her drawer, she found a slip of folded paper. She recognized it instantly by the handwriting, Graham's, sharp, clean strokes, efficient. It was a note he'd written her years ago after she pulled off a near-impossible conference setup with less than 24 hours' notice. He'd left it on her desk with a cup of black coffee and a single sentence, "You always do the impossible. Thank you." She stared at the note for a long time before placing it gently into the box. That was before he built his walls so high, before his world narrowed to profit margins and cold silences, before Asheville. The word rang through her memory like wind through dry leaves. She hadn't meant to think about that trip again, but it came anyway. It had been a wellness retreat for executives, a quiet place nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, full of overpriced green juices and stone meditation gardens. Graham had insisted on attending in person, something the board found curious, and he brought Claire along for logistics. But the truth was, neither of them had talked much about logistics that weekend. What she remembered most wasn't the meetings, or even the long drives between events. It was the way he'd looked at her across the dinner table on the final night. The room lit by warm amber sconces, the mountains silhouetted beyond the windows. There had been a pause in their conversation, a soft, almost sacred stillness, and in that quiet, his eyes had lingered just a moment too long, not with the sharp focus of a boss surveying a task, but with something else. Something that made her heart forget what it was supposed to do. He hadn't said anything then, neither did she, but that night, when their hands brushed in the hallway, and neither of them pulled away, something shifted, not a confession, not a declaration, just a knowing. And now, months later, here she was packing that moment away, too. Claire stood, her box full now, but her heart strangely empty. She took one last look around the office, the shelves she kept organized without being asked, the ficus plant near the window that she watered every Thursday, the digital clock that ran 2 minutes fast because Graham always liked being early. She had made a home out of this desk, not because she loved the job, though, in some ways. She did, but because it gave her something to hold on to when the world felt too wide. After her mother died, she had nothing and no one. Metasphere was stability, structure, a place where she mattered, where she was needed. And she had been needed until she wasn't. She lifted the box and walked slowly through the office, past familiar faces who now avoided eye contact, conversations that fell into whispers as she passed. No one stopped her, no one offered to help. Maybe they didn't know what to say, or maybe they'd already been told not to say anything at all. The elevator felt colder than usual. She stared at the digital display above the doors as the floors ticked downward, each one carrying her further away from a life she'd built with quiet dedication. On the ground floor, she paused by the lobby window. Outside, the streets were alive now, cars weaving through intersections, tourists pointing at maps, the sweet scent of magnolia trees mixing with city fumes. It was a normal morning. For everyone else, she walked out into it without fanfare. No tears, no dramatic exits, just a woman carrying a box that held 10 years of invisible effort. But Claire wasn't just carrying old belongings. She was carrying a question, heavy and unspoken. Was it because of that night? Because she had broken the unspoken rule? Because she had allowed herself for just one brief, human moment to hope? She didn't know. Graham hadn't answered. His silence had said everything and nothing all at once. She placed the box in her car, closed the door with careful finality, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The sun warmed the leather beneath her, the air still and thick with everything she wouldn't say. In that moment, Claire realized she hadn't just been fired from a job. She'd been removed from a space she'd occupied in someone else's life, like a picture taken down when the frame is no longer needed. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel. She didn't cry, not yet, but she knew something had broken. Quietly, permanently. The only sound was the river outside her window and the quiet ache that wouldn't leave her chest. Claire hadn't planned on coming to Waynesboro. It wasn't on her route, wasn't part of any escape strategy. But after 3 hours on the interstate, somewhere between the final glance at Charleston's skyline and the moment her stomach finally settled, she took the exit like muscle memory, a turn she hadn't made in over 20 years. Her great-aunt Louise had lived here, in a faded white house with green shutters and a front porch that creaked like it knew stories no one else could hear. Summers were spent here when Claire was young, before grief had become a permanent resident in her life, before she learned how to wear silence like armor. The town hadn't changed much. Waynesboro still leaned into the river like an old friend, its streets lined with cracked sidewalks and flower boxes clinging bravely to late summer blooms. There was only one pharmacy, one diner, one bridge that spanned the water and led nowhere in particular. Claire found a small apartment above what used to be a quilt shop. The for rent sign was faded, nearly illegible, but the landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Holloway didn't ask many questions. He handed her the key with a shrug and a mumbled quiet place for quiet people. That suited her just fine. The apartment was modest, one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, and a window overlooking the river bend. The floors creaked and the radiator groaned, but Claire didn't mind. There was something sacred about the slowness here, something she hadn't known she'd needed. She unpacked what little she'd brought: 2 suitcases, a stack of books, her mother's photo, and set about building a new kind of rhythm. Mornings were quiet. She made tea instead of coffee, walked along the riverbank with a journal tucked under her arm, spent hours reading on the old bench beneath the weeping willow by the water. She didn't speak to anyone, not yet. No one here knew her name, Ear. No one knew what had happened in Charleston. No one asked, and she didn't offer. Not about Metasphere, not about Graham, not about that night. It was easier this way. Easier to pretend she was just another woman starting over, not unraveling slowly, thread by thread, in the hush between chapters. One afternoon, Claire found herself at the town library. The building was small, with worn carpet and a front desk manned by a young woman who looked like she belonged in another decade. Claire wandered the shelves until she found a section on herbal teas and home remedies. It wasn't what she needed, not really, but it filled the time. That's what most of her days had become, filling the time. Until the morning, everything changed. It began as a strange heaviness behind her eyes, a dull nausea that crept in with the sunrise. She thought at first it was the humidity. The river air had grown thicker overnight, pressing against the window like a sigh. She skipped her tea, sat still for a while, trying to will her body back into balance. But the wave came again, stronger this time, stealing the breath from her lungs, bending her over the bathroom sink with a hand clutched to her chest. Claire sat on the edge of her bathtub for 10 full minutes after the spell passed, staring at the tiled floor, her mind silent in a way that felt almost cruel. No, it couldn't be. It was stress, exhaustion, nothing more. But still, something nudged at her. She dressed quietly and walked to the pharmacy. It was only 3 blocks away, but each step felt heavier than the last. The store was nearly empty, just an old man browsing cough drops and a teenage cashier half asleep at the counter. She found the test on the bottom shelf, picked the cheapest one, stared at the box in her hand for far too long before paying in cash and tucking it deep inside her canvas tote. Back at the apartment, she moved like someone outside herself, closed the blinds, turned off the fan, washed her hands twice, and then she waited. 5 minutes stretched like a lifetime. She paced the small kitchen, unable to sit, unable to breathe the same way she did yesterday. When she finally turned the test over, the world narrowed into 2 soft red lines. 2. It didn't feel real at first. The lines were too faint, too simple. How could something so small hold so much weight? But Claire knew. She pressed a hand to her stomach, not with panic, but awe, fear, yes, uncertainty, absolutely. But beneath all of that was something else, something quiet and ancient and fiercely alive, a beginning. She sat down on the bed, the sunlight slipping through the blinds and thin golden lines across her knees. The air smelled faintly of lavender and river water. For the first time in weeks, she wept. Not because she was lost, but because something inside her had just been found. She wasn't just starting over, she was starting for 2. The scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee welcomed her like an old friend. Claire hadn't meant to step inside. She'd only planned to walk past, maybe pause at the window. But something about the smell, warm, spiced, familiar in a way her heart hadn't felt in weeks, pulled her in before her thoughts could stop her. The Willow Cafe sat on the corner of Main Street, tucked between a bookstore that never seemed open and an antique shop that smelled like time. The cafe's brick walls bore the wear of decades, but inside it was soft and golden, mismatched chairs, some cushioned, some wicker, a wooden counter scarred with use. A maple tree just outside the window stretched its limbs over the building like a guardian. Claire stood near the entrance, unsure whether she was a customer or simply seeking a place to exist for a moment. Then came the voice. "You here for the coffee or the company?" It came from behind the counter, a woman with steel-gray curls pulled into a low knot, sleeves rolled, apron flour-dusted. She looked about 60, with the kind of eyes that saw too much but judged very little. Claire blinked. Maybe both. She answered quietly. The woman smiled, then grabbed a stool. "Ivy makes sure no one leaves empty." That was her Ivy. Owner, baker, barista, and, as Claire would later learn, something much more valuable in this town, a keeper of stories, a safe harbor. Over the next few days, Claire returned, at first just to sit, a muffin, a cup of tea, a quiet corner by the window. She brought a book once but never turned a page. Mostly, she watched. Watched the way Ivy greeted each regular by name, asked about their families, remembered how they liked their eggs, watched the light shift through the stained glass panel above the front door, watched the river shimmer past the window when the wind picked up. Then, one morning, after a particularly long silence and a second refill of her chamomile tea, Ivy approached. "You looking for something to do with your hands?" she asked, nodding at Claire's barely touched cup. Claire hesitated, but nodded. "Yes, I think I am." And just like that, she was hired 2 mornings a week. "Maybe more if you feel up to it," Ivy had said, handing her a clean apron and a small spiral-bound notepad. Claire didn't ask about pay. Ivy didn't ask about references. There was trust there, unspoken and immediate, like roots growing underground long before the blossom appears. She started slow clearing tables, wiping down the pastry case, jotting down how Mrs. Kellerman liked her toast no butter, cut diagonally, and how the Harris twins only drank milk if it came with sprinkles on top. Claire took notes on everything, not because she had to, but because remembering made her feel useful again. And it mattered to Ivy. The cafe had its own rhythm, soft and steady like a heartbeat. Ivy moved through the mornings like someone who had made peace with time, no rush, no panic, just presence. She never pried, not once. But now and then, she'd glance at Claire, eyes narrowed just slightly, like she could hear the quiet noise Claire was carrying. One particularly slow Tuesday. Claire stood behind the counter folding napkins. The morning rush had passed, and the radio hummed low with something jazzy and nostalgic. Ivy slid a fresh tray of cinnamon rolls onto the warmer, wiped her hands, and leaned against the sink. Without looking up, she said softly, "Some babies save us long before they arrive." The words floated between them, heavy and unexpected. Claire froze, her hands stilled, her breath hitched. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. Ivy didn't press. She walked to the front door and flipped the sign to closed, even though it was only 11:30. "Go take your break. Honey," she said over her shoulder. "Sunlight's perfect by the river right now." Claire stepped out into the warmth, the maple leaves fluttering in welcome. She crossed the street to the bench near the willow tree, the one she had walked past so many times, sat down slowly, palms resting on her knees. The river moved gently today, not rushing, not still, just flowing. She reached into her tote and pulled out a small, cloth-bound notebook. It was the one she had bought days ago at the drugstore, intending to write something. Anything, but too afraid to begin. Now. She opened it. The first page was blank, the second too. But on the third, she finally wrote, "You don't know me yet, but I already love you." Her handwriting wavered, soft and slanted. She paused, let the words breathe. Then, below that, she wrote, "I don't have a plan. I don't have a timeline. But I have hope. And I think that might be enough for us to begin." Claire closed the notebook and placed it gently in her lap. A soft wind lifted her hair, brushing her cheek like a whisper. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. The woman in the mirror looked like her, but softer, almost like a mother. Claire stood barefoot in the small bathroom of her apartment, one hand resting lightly beneath her ribcage, the other tracing the curve of her cheek. Her reflection stared back with quiet disbelief. The face was still hers, same hazel eyes, same fine lines beginning to crease at the corners, but something had shifted. There was a fullness in her cheeks, a flush in her skin, and a gentleness she hadn't seen before. Not since her mother passed, not since Graham, not since Charleston. She had started noticing changes in her body, how her skin had become more sensitive, how certain smells clung longer than they should. The fatigue arrived early in the day now, settling into her bones by mid-afternoon, like a gentle but insistent hand guiding her to slow down. Some mornings, the nausea would visit like an old acquaintance brief, unannounced and oddly reassuring in its constancy. Still, nothing prepared her for the moment she first heard the heartbeat. It happened in the quietest of rooms, the small clinic tucked behind the pharmacy on Maple Street. The nurse, kind and discreet, had placed the Doppler on her belly without much ceremony. Claire had been holding her breath without knowing it. And then, there it was, a rapid, rhythmic pulse, soft at first, then stronger, like tiny wings beating against the dark. She didn't cry in the dramatic way she might have imagined. There was no gasp, no trembling hands, no cinematic music playing in her head, just stillness. And then tears she hadn't felt coming, slipping down her cheeks in complete silence. She wasn't even sure if they were sorrow or awe, maybe both. Back home. She lay on the couch that evening, with a pillow tucked beneath her knees, one hand gently resting where she now knew life was blooming. She whispered, "You're really here." And for the first time, she said it out loud. "We're going to be okay." From that moment, she began reshaping the outline of her future. She pulled out her old planner, not to schedule meetings or set color-code client calls, but to map a different kind of plan. One that didn't include boardrooms or annual reports. One that didn't include Graham. She wrote down baby names she liked. She noted which vegetables she could keep down. She marked her next prenatal visit with a small star. There was pain in letting go of the life she thought she was building. But there was also freedom. A strange, open freedom in knowing she didn't have to wait for anyone to choose her. Each night before bed, Claire opened the small notebook she had started for the baby. She would read from the novels she loved most, softly, slowly, not caring if the words reached anywhere just yet. It was a ritual, a tether to something bigger than herself. Sometimes, Ivy would sit with her after closing the cafe. They didn't talk about much, just shared space, shared tea, shared silence. One night, as they folded dish towels and listened to the wind through the maple leaves outside, Ivy had said, "You seem lighter lately." Claire smiled. "I think I am." Then, after a pause, she added, "I don't really have anyone. Not in the way people usually mean it." Ivy didn't flinch, just looked at her gently, eyes soft beneath her silver curls. "Well," she said, "you've got me. And sometimes, one steady person is all it takes." Claire said nothing, but something in her heart unclenched. Later that week, she stayed after hours to help Ivy clean. The cafe smelled of fresh lemon soap and cinnamon. The chairs stacked, the cash drawer counted. Claire stood near the front window, adjusting a crooked open sign that had been slightly off for days. It was then she saw him, across the street, standing still, watching. He wasn't moving, just there, beneath the dim lamplight, hands in his coat pockets. His hair was slightly longer than she remembered, shoulders a little more hunched. She couldn't see his eyes, but the shape, the way he stood, the tilt of his head, it was too familiar, too precise. Graham. Her body stiffened. She stepped back, heart hammering loud in her chest, louder than the ticking clock above the espresso machine. It couldn't be. Not here, not now. But he didn't cross the street. He didn't wave. He didn't even shift his weight. Just stood there, like a ghost uncertain whether to haunt or vanish. Claire ducked behind the curtain that separated the front window from the kitchen. Her breath came shallow, her hand instinctively moving to the place just below her belly. What would she even say if he came inside? What part of herself would speak first, the woman who loved him once, or the one he had left behind without a word? No, she wasn't ready. Not yet. She stayed there, behind the curtain, heart pounding, eyes squeezed shut. The street remained quiet. When she finally peeked again, the sidewalk was empty. He was gone. Or maybe he'd never been there at all. But something inside her had shifted again. The safety she'd built, the new rhythm, the soft hope blooming in her chest. It felt suddenly fragile, as if the past, no matter how far she'd run, still knew her name. In the quiet of his office, Graham sat with a pen in hand and guilt he couldn't name. The building was nearly empty. Most of the Metasphere staff had gone home hours ago, their footsteps long faded from the marble floors. Outside, Charleston blinked in amber streetlight and coastal haze. But inside, the only sound was the soft scratch of pen on paper and the muted hum of the air conditioning system that never fully turned off. Graham Whitaker was no stranger to silence. Since his wife passed, silence had become a kind of partner, unforgiving, patient, ever present. But lately, it had begun to press in from the edges. Not peaceful, not meditative, claustrophobic. He stared down at the page on his desk. His handwriting looked foreign to him, neat, but uncertain, like it belonged to someone trying too hard to keep his hands from shaking. "Claire, there are things I should have said when you were still close enough to hear them." He paused. What was the point? He'd written versions of this letter dozens of times since she left. Not one had been sent. They sat in the bottom drawer of his desk, folded neatly, unsigned, some scrawled in anger, others in regret, most in the middle wandering, rambling, aching. After he let her go, he told himself it was for the best. That he'd overstepped, that she'd crossed a line, that they had blurred something that should have stayed sharp, that professionalism had to come first. But none of those things helped him sleep. And lately, sleep was a stranger too. Every night, he saw her face, not angry, not even sad, just still. That quiet kind of disappointment that spoke louder than any outburst. He remembered the way she folded the letter before she left. Not with resentment, with dignity. God, the dignity of her. He leaned back in his chair, pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead. The office lights flickered briefly before settling into their usual dim glow. The city buzzed somewhere far below, but up here, he was alone with memories. A knock came at the doorframe. He looked up, startled. It was Hannah, one of his longtime assistants. She held a folder in her arms and an apologetic smile on her face. "Didn't mean to interrupt," she said gently. He cleared his throat. "You're not... What is it?" She stepped inside, placing the file on his desk. Quarterly projections. But also, "I ran into Linda from the events team the other day." Graham nodded absently, but something about her tone made him glance up. "She mentioned Claire," Hannah added carefully. That name still felt like a dropped glass. "Oh," he asked, trying too hard to sound unaffected. "Yeah, just in passing. Said she thought Claire might be living near Waynesboro." A pause. "Cute little river town," she said. "Quiet." Graham said nothing. His fingers moved slightly against the pen, like it had burned him. She looked, well, according to Linda. Hannah continued, "Peaceful. Peaceful." It was the one thing he hadn't been since she left. After she exited, Graham sat still for several minutes. Then, wordlessly, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a small, discreet business card. D. Carson, Private Investigations. Discretion guaranteed. He didn't know what he was looking for. But he knew he couldn't keep doing nothing. 2 days later, Carson came to him with a manila envelope and a raised eyebrow. "Didn't take long," he said. "Small towns are good like that. People talk." Graham nodded once and took the file. He waited until the door shut behind the man before opening it. Inside were a few notes addressed. Routine, where she worked. But what stopped his breath was the photograph. Claire. Standing just outside a small cafe. The Willow, the sign said. She was holding a tray, hair tied back, sunlight resting gently across her shoulders. Her face was flushed from effort or perhaps the heat, but she was smiling at someone just off frame. And then, there it was, the curve of her belly. Undeniable, beautiful, inarguable. He stared. Every part of him went still. It was like his brain refused to process it all at once, offering fragments instead. Claire, pregnant, still in Waynesboro, still alive, still building something. Without him, his hand tightened on the edge of the photo. All the excuses unraveled at once. She hadn't disappeared. She hadn't been dramatic, or unstable, or unprofessional. She had been honest, brave, human, and she had walked away because he gave her no choice. He had pushed her out when she needed safety, silenced her when she needed to be heard, dismissed her when she was at her most vulnerable. Now, he saw it for what it was. Not professionalism, not leadership, cowardice. He leaned back in his chair again, this time not to rest, but to breathe. Time had been his shield, silence, his comfort. But now he had neither, not anymore. He looked back down at the photo, his eyes drawn again to the gentle curve of her body. She was carrying more than just the memory of what they once shared. She was carrying his child. He pressed his fingers to the paper like it might ground him, then reached for one of the unsent letters in his drawer. He read it, slowly, and then tore it in half. None of those words would work now. They were too late. What he needed wasn't a letter. It was courage. She felt it before she saw him, like the shift in wind before a storm. It was late afternoon in Waynesboro, the kind of day where the sun stayed hidden behind thick gray clouds, casting a silver sheen over the river's surface. Claire liked these days best. The light didn't demand anything. The world felt softer, quieter, a place to disappear without really vanishing. She walked slowly along the river path, one hand resting on the subtle swell of her belly, the other brushing against the overgrown wildflowers lining the gravel edge. This had become her daily ritual, a walk at dusk. Just her and the child inside her, whose presence grew more real with each passing day. She often spoke out loud, but only when she was sure no one was nearby. Today, we had apple slices and peanut butter for lunch. You didn't protest. Pause. Good. We're getting somewhere. Sometimes she read from a book. Other times, she simply hummed the tune her mother used to sing when she thought no one was listening. These were her quiet offerings to the little life growing inside a kind of whispered promise that, even in all her uncertainty, she was trying. Claire paused at the bend where the path curved closest to the water, the current moving slow and glassy in the low light. Her breath caught in the cool air. Fall was beginning to hint at its arrival, and the maple tree above her had begun shedding early leaves, one or two spinning gently to the ground. Then, she felt it, a change in the atmosphere, not a sound, not a movement, just an awareness. She turned. Across the street, on the far edge of the road that bordered the riverbank, stood a figure, still, unmoving, watching. It was him, Graham. There was no mistaking him now. He wasn't some flicker in a dream, not a ghost in a memory. He was standing there in the flesh hands in his coat pockets, shoulders squared in that way she remembered. Even from a distance, the weight in his expression reached her. Their eyes met. For a moment, time folded in on itself. Claire forgot how to breathe. The world went silent except for the echo of blood rushing in her ears. She didn't move, neither did he. But her hand almost involuntarily tightened around her belly. Protective, reflexive. And he noticed. She could see it in the slight tilt of his head, the way his jaw tensed. He'd seen it in the photograph. Yes, but this was different. This was real, and she was no longer just the woman he let go. She was carrying the part of him he'd never asked to find. The moment stretched long and thin between them. He didn't step forward. He didn't wave. He didn't call her name. He just stood there. Then, without a word, Graham turned and walked away. No urgency, no explanation, just gone. Claire stood frozen in place, the wind brushing her hair across her face, her breath still shallow. Every wall she had built in the past few months, every quiet defense, every small comfort shivered beneath the weight of his presence. He had found her. He knew. He had looked into her life from the outside, and now, he was here. Why now? She sat on the wooden bench beneath the willow tree, the same bench where she'd once written to the baby. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled slightly in her lap, the way they had when she first saw the test. Everything she had prepared for suddenly felt unfinished. He had always been composed, even in conflict, even in grief. But that look in his eyes today, it wasn't control. It was bare and terrifying. She walked home slowly, the clouds hanging low above her, pressing against the evening light. The cafe lights were off when she passed the willow. Ivy must have closed early, Claire thought, just briefly, of going in. Of saying something, but what would she even say? Back in her apartment, the air felt too still. She made tea, then didn't drink it. She opened a book, then closed it again. Every room echoed differently now, like it had absorbed the moment and wouldn't let her forget. Later that night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan as it spun in slow, rhythmic circles. The soft hum usually lulled her to sleep. Not tonight. Not with that image carved into her mind, Graham standing by the river. Not reaching for her, but not running either. She thought of all the ways this could unravel, all the pain that could surface again, all the pieces she had stitched back together, now trembling along their seams. Maybe he had changed, maybe he hadn't, but none of that mattered yet, because he had seen her, and she had seen him. And whatever story had been frozen between them was no longer standing still. Claire didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling, counting the ways this could fall apart all over again. They met again by chance, or maybe fate had run out of patience. The river moved like a breath beside the park, steady and slow under the weight of a gray sky. It was the kind of afternoon that held its own silence thick, almost sacred. Claire had come to the bench without thinking. It was her usual spot now, the one carved beneath the old willow where the wind always knew how to hush her thoughts. She sat with her hands folded gently over her belly, a scarf wrapped snug around her shoulders. She hadn't slept well the night before. Her thoughts had churned long past midnight, circling Graham's face, his stillness, that unspoken question in his eyes. Now. She stared ahead, eyes following the river's curl around the far bend, not expecting company, but she felt it again, that shift, that almost imperceptible tension in the air, like how the temperature dips right before it rains. She turned slightly and there he was. Graham. Not across the street this time. Not from afar. He was there. Walking slowly down the path, hands in his coat pockets, gaze lowered as though unsure of where to look. She felt her heart knock against her chest, not from love, not from longing, from the simple raw weight of seeing him again. He approached the bench but didn't speak. For a moment, it seemed he might turn around. Then without asking, he sat, not too close. A careful gap remained between them. The bench was old, worn at the edges. She could feel the way the wood bowed slightly beneath their weight, how the wind curled between them like a third presence. The silence stretched. Claire didn't feel it, neither did he. Then finally, she said, without looking at him, "You followed me." Graham exhaled, slow. "I did." Claire's fingers curled slightly in her lap. She didn't respond. Another beat passed. "I didn't plan this," he added. "I didn't think it would happen like this. But then again, I didn't think through much of anything. Did I?" She turned to him, just slightly. Her voice was low, flat. "What do you want?" "Graham." It wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It was worse than that. It was tired, measured, as if she had already asked herself the same thing and found no satisfying answer. He looked at her then, not at her belly, not at her hands, just at her. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Claire let out a breath through her nose. She looked back toward the water. "You think that's enough?" "No," he said. "I don't." She waited, expecting more. But Graham didn't defend himself, didn't rush to explain or justify. He sat with it, the weight of her question, the truth of her pain. "I was a coward," he said, finally. "I was afraid of what I felt, afraid of what it meant to care about someone again. After Helen, I told myself there wouldn't be room for that anymore. That business was safer. That control kept things from breaking." He glanced down. His voice dropped. "But I broke something anyway." Claire swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight. He continued. "I kept waiting for the right moment, to reach out, to fix it. But I think part of me hoped you'd just fade, that the memory would soften, that if I worked hard enough, buried myself deep enough, I wouldn't have to confront what I did." Claire shook her head slowly. "You didn't just hurt me, Graham. You erased me. You made a decision that changed my life, our lives, and didn't even ask to understand why." He didn't argue. His shoulders sagged. "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't come here to ask for anything." She turned to face him, fully now, then why he looked at her, eyes tired, honest, "Because I needed you to know that I see it now, all of it, and I don't expect forgiveness. I haven't earned that. But I need to be here, not for me, for the baby." Claire blinked. He went on, slowly, choosing each word like a stone being placed carefully on a fragile path. "I'm not asking to be let in. I know I lost that right. But if there's room, just a little, I'd like to show up, even if it's just in the background, even if it's quiet." Claire didn't speak. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. He kept his eyes forward, as if afraid that looking at her would undo everything he'd managed to say. "I missed the beginning," he said. "I don't want to miss the rest." The wind shifted again, brushing strands of hair across Claire's face. She tucked them behind her ear with trembling fingers. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust the way her heart still recognized his voice, still bent slightly in its direction. And trust, for her, was everything now? "I don't trust you," she said, voice steady. "And I can't afford to." The words landed like stones in the quiet. Graham nodded once. He didn't flinch. "I understand." The river continued its slow winding behind them. Children laughed faintly in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked, then silence again. They sat like that for a while longer, two people who once stood too close, now learning the weight of space. Then Claire stood. Her hand went again to her belly, protective, thoughtful. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. He didn't knock. He just sat in his car, watching the porch light flicker like it was waiting too. It had become a ritual now. Every evening, just after the sun dipped below the hills and Waynesboro turned the color of dusk, Graham would drive the quiet two-lane road that curved through the edge of town and park 2 houses down from Claire's building. He never got out, never approached, just watched. From the distance, he could see the light above her porch warm, steady, a bit temperamental. It sometimes blinked once or twice before settling into its glow. He'd sit there with the engine off, hands folded in his lap, the faint sound of crickets just audible through the cracked window. This was all he allowed himself, presence without intrusion, an apology without a demand. At first, Claire didn't notice. Or maybe she did but chose not to look out. Maybe that was her own kind of boundary. But Ivy noticed. She always noticed. One morning at the cafe, Ivy stood at the counter folding napkins when Graham stepped in. He didn't speak, just nodded a soft greeting. She nodded back, no questions. Just a knowing look passed between them, like the flicker of an old lamp that didn't need replacing just a gentle hand. From then on, Graham came in once a week, always in the morning, always quiet. He'd buy a cinnamon roll and a small paper bag of the peanut butter cookies Ivy knew Claire kept in her kitchen cabinet. Sometimes he lingered. Sometimes he left quickly. But every time, Ivy packed the bag carefully, folded the top with purpose, and handed it over without comment. That, too, was part of the quiet healing. And then came the chair. He had driven past the old hardware store 3 times before finally pulling in. The place sold everything from garden tools to dusty furniture, wooden things that creaked when you looked at them too long. It was the rocker that caught his eye. Simple, weathered, painted white with soft gray cushions. It looked like it belonged on a porch somewhere, just like Claire's. Not showy, not new, but waiting for someone to come home and sit. He didn't ask if it could be delivered. He carried it himself, balancing its awkward weight in the back of his SUV, straining just slightly as he eased it onto her porch in the late afternoon. The sun was low, no one was outside. He left a folded note on the seat, handwritten on torn paper from the cafe for you, or her, or both. And then he drove away. He didn't know what she'd do. Maybe she'd leave it out for the trash. Maybe she'd throw the note away. He didn't expect anything. But the next evening, when he parked down the block again, the chair was still there, moved slightly to the side, turned just enough to face the river, not the road. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. 2 nights later, the chair had a blanket draped across the back. A small book sat on the armrest. She was using it. Not for him. Not because of him. But because it had found its place. The next time he visited the cafe, Ivy handed him his bag with the usual nod. But this time, she didn't turn away right after. He stood still, uncertain. "I saw the chair," she said softly. Graham swallowed. "I wasn't trying to prove anything." Ivy's eyes held his like an anchor. "Good. Because you can't." He looked down. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper bag. "I don't know how to fix what I broke," he said, almost to himself. There was a long pause. Then Ivy, with the gentleness of someone who'd seen more life than most, replied, "Maybe you don't fix. Maybe you show up anyway." She wiped her hands on her apron and walked back to the kitchen. Graham stood there for a few seconds longer, letting the words settle. That evening, Claire came home from the cafe just after sunset. She slipped out of her shoes at the door, changed into a soft cardigan, and stepped out onto the porch without thinking. The chair waited. She eased herself into it, slowly, her back grateful for the support. Her body softer these days, the baby pushing gently against her ribs. She tucked the blanket around her legs, leaned back, and exhaled. The breeze rustled the trees. Somewhere in the distance, the river murmured its steady lullaby. She placed one hand on her belly and rocked slowly, the chair creaking like it was learning how to belong again. She had the name before she had the courage to say it out loud. It started as a whisper in her journal, long before the bump grew visible beneath her sweaters, before Graham showed up at the river, before the porch light became a promise. She kept a small notebook tucked in the nightstand drawer, soft leather cover, pages dog-eared and smudged with ink. In it, she wrote down pieces of her days, what she ate, what she feared, what she wished the baby would one day know. And always, she returned to the same question: what name would carry her child forward? Some evenings, she sat by the window, watching the wind comb through the trees, a cup of chamomile cooling beside her. She'd read through baby name books, circle and cross out, then start again. Some names were too delicate, others too heavy. Nothing ever felt just right. Until one night, without ceremony, it came to her. Ella. 3 simple letters that filled the room like a candle lit in stillness. Her mother's name. She had tucked it away for years, too sacred to speak aloud, too painful to wear close to the skin. But now it felt like a return, a quiet homage, a bridge between what had been lost and what was still to come. Ella, soft, strong, familiar like the scent of old books and vanilla tea. Claire wrote it down in the middle of a clean page. Beneath it, one word: hope. because that's what had carried her through every unsteady morning, every moment she thought she couldn't do this alone. Hope had moved her feet to Waynesboro. Hope had taught her to walk again. Ella Hope Halstead. She said it aloud once, just to the walls. Just to be sure. Her voice trembled, not with uncertainty, but with reverence. And the baby, as if answering, gave the slightest flutter beneath her ribs. She didn't tell anyone. Not yet, not Ivy, not even herself in the mirror. Some truths needed to steep slowly before they could be poured. It wasn't until the last Sunday of September that she saw Graham again. Not on the porch, not from a distance, but beside her. They had fallen into a tentative rhythm, passing each other in public spaces, exchanging nods, sometimes a good morning at the cafe. Never forced, never invasive, just present. That day. The weather had turned unusually warm for fall. Claire had walked down to the river for some air, her steps slower now, her back beginning to ache in the evenings. She found a shaded path just beyond the main bench, under a patch of birch trees. To her surprise, Graham was already there, book in hand, seated quietly on a different bench, looking out at the water. He looked up, nodded. She hesitated, then sat across from him on the low stone wall edging the path. For a few minutes, they didn't speak. The air was too gentle, the silence too delicate. Then, without preamble, Claire said, "I've picked a name." Graham blinked, closed the book slowly. "Yeah." She nodded. "Ella." He smiled faintly. "That's beautiful." "She was my mother." His expression softened further. "I remember you mentioning her once." There was a pause. She looked down at her hands resting on her belly. "And her middle name is Hope," she added. Graham's voice was low. Fitting. Claire nodded again, but didn't smile. Then came the moment she knew would land heavier than the rest. Her last name will be Halstead. Graham didn't flinch, but his lips pressed together slightly. His eyes searched hers, not in anger, not in protest, just with quiet understanding. He asked, gently, not Blake. Claire met his gaze. "Blake is something you have to earn," she said, "not assume." She didn't say it to wound him. She said it because it was true. Because names weren't just letters on paper. They were stories. And Claire was still deciding how much of her story would include him. Graham took a breath, then nodded, slowly, thoughtfully. "She'll earn her own name," he said. "I'll earn mine." The river moved behind them, slow and unbothered, like it had heard harder things before and survived them all. Claire looked at him for a long moment. No tears, no tension, just the first glimpse of something new. Space, perhaps, or possibility. Later that night, Claire sat in the rocking chair Graham had given her. A light breeze moved through the screen door. The baby shifted gently beneath her ribs, a rhythm she had come to know like her own breath. She opened her notebook again and turned to the page where she'd written the name. This time, she underlined it, Ella Hope Halstead. She traced each letter slowly, then wrote beneath it, "You are not born into perfection. You are born into love, and we grow from there." She didn't know what kind of father Graham would become, but she knew what kind of mother she would be, one who protected, one who remembered, one who forgave without forgetting. And maybe that would be enough. For the first time, Claire believed maybe he really meant it. Rain tapped the windows like fingers searching for comfort. It had started just after sunset. First a drizzle, then a steady pour. By nightfall, the skies opened fully, and the little town of Waynesboro became a cradle for thunder and soft flashes of lightning that danced along the horizon. Claire had always loved storms. They reminded her of her mother's voice, strong, unshaken, something that rumbled before it soothed. But that night, as she stood in the kitchen making tea, she doubled over. A slow, sharp pressure bloomed in her lower back, not unfamiliar, but deeper than before. Different. She held the edge of the counter, breathing slow. It passed. Then came another. Her hand went to her belly, as if asking permission. "Not yet," she whispered. "We're not ready." But babies rarely ask permission. They arrive on their own tides. She called Ivy. By the time Ivy arrived soaked in rain, cheeks flushed, Claire was on the couch, pale and gripping the pillow with both hands. "You need a hospital," Ivy said, already pulling out her phone. "No," Claire breathed. "It's too soon. Exactly why we're not waiting." Ivy's voice was calm, but firm, like a rope in rushing water. As the ambulance sirens pierced the sound of rain, Claire clutched her overnight bag. Her contractions were close now, too close. Her body trembled from both pain and the speed at which the world had tilted. Ivy climbed into the ambulance beside her, squeezing her hand. "You've got this, sweetheart. I'm right here." As the doors closed, Ivy's other hand moved quickly over her phone. "Graham!" He had just turned off the highway, his car moving carefully through sheets of rain when the call came in. "Ivy!" His voice broke with worry. "She's on her way to the hospital. It's happening. I'm coming. No time to hesitate. Graham, this is it." And he didn't. When Claire arrived, the nurses moved quickly, monitoring, whispering, adjusting. The storm had cut power briefly in parts of the hospital earlier, and the backup lights still hummed. The halls glowed dimly, like the inside of a dream. Her room was small but quiet, clean white sheets, a steady beeping monitor, and the low hum of thunder beyond the window. She lay back, one arm over her eyes, teeth clenched. Time no longer moved in minutes, but in waves of pain, of breath, of surrender. And then, a voice, low, familiar, Claire. She opened her eyes. Graham stood in the doorway, soaked through, shirt clinging to him, hair flattened by rain. But his face was open, raw. He didn't step forward. He waited. The pain came again. She turned her head and groaned, body curling. A nurse reached for her hand, but Claire shook her head. "Let him." Graham stepped forward and took her hand. It was warm, solid. She didn't look at him, but she didn't pull away either. Minutes turned to hours. The rain never stopped. Claire cried only once, not from pain, but from fear. At the moment when she thought she couldn't go further, when her body betrayed her with exhaustion, and her breathing turned frantic. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't do this." Graham bent close, his forehead almost touching hers. His voice was barely audible over the storm outside. "You already are." She clenched his hand so tightly he thought his fingers might bruise, but he didn't let go. Then a gasp, a cry, not Claire's, tiny, sharp, full of protest and life. The sound cracked open the world. The room exhaled. The nurses moved like gentle tides around them. One laid a small, swaddled form against Claire's chest. Claire looked down, dazed, undone, awed. A pair of wide, blinking eyes met hers. Ella Hope, so small, so alive, so absolutely hers. Graham leaned over her shoulder, and Claire let him. His breath caught as he looked down at the child. Their child. The room was quiet again, save for the rain and the tiny hiccups of a newborn adjusting to light, to air, to existence. Claire didn't say thank you, but she didn't let go of his hand either. Healing, like gardening, takes patience, and sunshine, and time. It didn't happen all at once. There was no sweeping reconciliation, no grand romantic declaration beneath the stars. Just days, ordinary days stacked like bricks, slowly building something that neither of them dared name too soon. Graham didn't move in. He never asked. Instead, he came by each afternoon with a fresh bottle for Ella and a soft book tucked under his arm. He stayed long enough to rock her to sleep, sometimes humming tunelessly, sometimes just listening to the way her breathing steadied when held. Claire watched from the porch more often than she joined. There was safety in observation, in giving her heart the room it needed to breathe again. Some evenings, he stayed to make tea. They sat outside, the baby monitor between them, speaking not of the past, but of small things, cloud shapes, favorite childhood cereals, the strange comfort of silence. One day, Ivy handed Claire a worn key tied with twine. "For you too," she said. "A fresh patch out back. Was going to be a storage shed, but I think it wants more than that. Behind the cafe, where the gravel thinned into grass and sunlight lingered a bit longer each day." Claire found the small plot of land, uneven, a bit rocky, but filled with promise. They called it the start. Graham brought tools and gloves too big for Claire's hands. She brought seeds, carrot, basil, and zinnia, and an old kneeling mat her mother once used. They didn't speak much as they worked. Claire pressed her fingers into the soil like she was remembering something. Graham moved gently around her, clearing debris, brushing leaves aside like they might reveal something precious underneath. He chose white chrysanthemums. She laughed softly when he told her, "You know those are funeral flowers." He only shrugged, or maybe reminders that something always follows the ending. The garden grew slowly, as gardens do. The carrots came first, green shoots poking up like shy ideas, then basil, fragrant and stubborn. The zinnias bloomed in bright defiance, and the chrysanthemums, those came last, unfolding like forgiveness. Inside the house, Claire wrote in the quiet hours when Ella napped against her chest. Stories about brave little girls and foxes who lost their way but found home in unexpected places. She wrote in longhand, crossing out whole pages, then starting again. One story she finished completely. It was about a baby named Ella who planted a garden on the moon. She didn't show it to Graham, not yet. One afternoon, when the garden was thick with late summer green and the sun hung lower in the sky, Graham laid Ella down on the blanket beside the zinnias. She babbled, kicking her feet, her tiny fingers gripping the edges of her plush rabbit. Claire knelt nearby, brushing dirt from her palms. Ella turned her head, looked up at Graham. Her mouth formed around the sound with surprising clarity. Da-da. Everything stopped. Claire's hands froze midair. Graham's breath caught. Even the wind seemed to pause. He didn't react right away, almost afraid to claim it. Then slowly, he smiled. Claire sat back on her heels, stunned. She said it. She whispered, "I heard." Ella squealed, as if pleased with herself, then promptly tried to chew on a leaf. Graham laughed deep and full, the kind that hadn't touched his lungs in years. Claire looked at him then, really looked, and in that moment, something softened. Not fully, not forever, but enough. That evening, Graham carried Ella inside while Claire watered the last of the herbs. When he returned to the porch, she was waiting there, arms crossed, a light breeze tugging at her cardigan. "She's going to ask about you one day," Claire said. "I know. What will you say?" He didn't hesitate. "That I almost missed everything, but I got lucky, and her mom let me try again." Claire didn't reply right away. Instead, she reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The story. She placed it in his hand. "Ella on the moon," she said. He looked down at the cover, then back at her. "She finds her way home in the end," Claire added. He nodded. Claire turned to go back inside, but paused at the door. She didn't say yes, but she smiled, and that was a start. Out back, the last rays of light touched the edge of the garden. A chrysanthemum opened, pale and unassuming. And somewhere, beneath the hush of evening, a small girl's laughter echoed warm, certain, and brand new. Sometimes, life doesn't give us closure in the way we expect. People leave, promises break, and silence replaces explanations. But even in the deepest kind of hurt, there is still room for grace, for growth, and for something new to bloom. Claire's story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from the person who hurt us. It often begins when we decide we are worthy of something better, even if we have to build it from scratch. She didn't wait to be rescued. She chose to start again. And in doing so, she found strength she never knew she had. Forgiveness, too, is not about forgetting. It's about choosing peace over bitterness. Graham's journey was not about asking for love, but about showing up for it, day after day. This story is not just about motherhood, or romance, or second chances. It's about quiet courage, the kind that grows slowly like a garden and teaches us that, even after all we've lost, we are still capable of creating something beautiful. Because in the end, love isn't a grand gesture. It's a presence, a choice, a seed we tend, one day at a time. Thank you for spending your time with us and walking alongside Claire's journey. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of your own strength, or simply made you pause and feel, please consider supporting our channel. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story that might speak right to your soul. Until next time, take care and keep a quiet place in your heart for stories that heal.